My most viewed video on the channel was a breakdown of hypotheses for the ethno-linguistic genesis of the Indo-Europeans. I created a map to help visualize the context of the ethnogenesis, showing the ethno-linguistic groups or groupings around them. And reading through the comments, most people have found the maps to be helpful, and some people had some valid criticisms of certain points that I made in my presentation, and I agree with a lot of them. I've learned a lot since then and looked into a few specific questions. So I'm here today to respond with some additional notes as well as edits to the map with a new map. And hopefully this new map will be a little more informative, a little more helpful. It's certainly easier to edit than creating basically a whole map art project every time I need to do a video. So my entire point and methodology in doing this is just trying to visualize what we know all together. There are going to be varying degrees of accuracy in where these groups are, at what times, how they interact with each other, but the point is to try to be comprehensive and create a model that does try to show all these things. Through running the model and testing it and criticizing it and iterating on it, I think that we can get a better and better and better picture of how these human migrations and linguistic evolutions and so on, cultural exchanges might have happened. The methodology here is, how do we visualize this? How do I show this? So if something doesn't seem accurate, the question is, okay, is not just, oh, that's not true, or that's not absolutely confirmed. It's more so, well, how do we visualize what might have happened? This is supposed to be part of a larger project and series that I'll be doing, mapping out all the ethno-linguistic families of the Earth, basically. I've been doing a lot of research, usually in terms of mythology, about the different major categories and groups of pantheons and such, and that correlates a lot with linguistic families and ancestries, all different factors. So this is an example of like a full simplified categorical breakdown of human migration. Basically, I will be doing that in this more detailed format for videos going forward. So if you like that premise, please like the video and subscribe and suggest which ones you'd like me to do next. As you can see on here, there's a few different colors. The Afro-Asiatic family is down here. That's one of the upcoming videos. My very next video, I think, is probably going to be the Mediterranean Neolithic early European farmer sort of remnant, which is very interesting. Hopefully this is a little helpful. Let's return to this video to get kind of bearings. I'm assuming that most of you have already heard of the Indo-European linguistic family and the Proto-Indo-European Yamnaya, who spread that language into most of Europe, Anatolia, Iran, India, and Central Asia. So right off the bat, I'm going to correct myself a little bit. I use the term, like a lot of people actually use the term Yamnaya to describe basically all of the Proto-Indo-Europeans. Like just anything that is Indo-European or Proto-Indo-European goes back to the Yamnaya. And that's not entirely accurate. Now, I was aware at the time that there are obviously all these there's a whole horizon of cultures that could be considered Proto-Indo-European, spanning across this whole region here. And that's generally like said to be the Volga-Ural Steppe. So the Ural Mountains are here, and the Volga River is here. Right, so the Yamnaya were just one phase, one archaeological finding culture, site complex that was around this region. They were kind of bridging more into the Don River and such, and were kind of a later stage of the whole horizon here. For this map, I've still referred to the broad category of those groups as Yamnayan or Yamnian, which really is just like Yamnaya-like, Yamnaya-adjacent, leading up to Yamnaya, related to it. So it's really just a broad sweeping generalized term for the entire Proto-Indo-European spectrum. Sredny Stog, Khvalynsk. So that's one little slight correction, but I think when most people are saying Yamnaya or Yamnayan or a Proto-Indo-European, they basically mean the entire spectrum. Prevailing hypothesis as to where the Proto-Indo-Europeans and their language came from is the Kurgan hypothesis, which credits the Eurasian steppe in modern Ukraine as the homeland of Indo-European mother tongue. The mother culture is thought to be the Yamnaya, a nomadic cattle culture with some evidence of early horseback riding to aid in cattle ranching. Perhaps they were the first cowboys, but they mostly used ox-pulled wagons to get around. So that's also true. Still, I was very ambiguous about they could have been, and there is indeed some evidence of very early horseback riding. Not like stirrups or anything. I think some of the earliest forms of like using horses for hunting would be with javelins. And yes, some early archery might have been even before they had stirrups or anything else to help them kind of hold on. They still could have used basic ranged weaponry when they're hunting animals, or if they're trying to herd cattle and such. But yeah, they would have been early on solid wheels, not spoked wheels. That was a later innovation by the Sintashta culture, which are basically the Proto-Indo-Iranians. These solid wheels are not the kinds of wheels that you can hook up to a war chariot. These are just for transporting things and people. And they have been in use in general, probably when the first farmers were coming out from the Near East and Anatolia, spreading across Europe, for instance. According to genetic research into the Yamnaya and the steppe ancestry of Indo-Europeans, about 50% of that ancestry is from Caucasian hunter-gatherers, who were ancestral to both the Caucasian makeup culture and the early European farmer Cucuteni-Trypillian culture. Ignore that. They were not exactly the same. The Caucasian hunter-gatherers, which adopted agriculture, becoming part of them Neolithic farmers, Caucasian Neolithic farmers, so same people, just transitioning from hunter-gatherer to farming, are over here, obviously around the Caucasus Mountains is their homeland. The Anatolian hunter-gatherers and Neolithic farmers, on the other hand, were in this kind of southern and western Anatolia region. The Anatolians kind of were doing their own thing and more closely related ancestrally with even early Western hunter-gatherers in Europe. So basically, Europe and Anatolia were like one thing very, very long time ago. And the Caucasians and the Zagrotians, so like this lower Iranian hunter-gatherers and Neolithic farmers, they were together one group kind of in this Caspian, Caucasus, Iran region at one point. Pretty distinct from one another. Not completely distinct because they're both West Eurasian, fundamentally, but it was a pretty old kind of split that happened between those two. So that was probably the core of one of my biggest mistakes in this video. I had thought that all Neolithic West Asian peoples were probably related, and from what I was looking at the time, it seemed to make sense following the agricultural revolution out into the Caucasus, into Anatolia, into Europe, all at kind of the same time. I figured it was demic or demographic or actual peopling event entirely, but some cases were peopling. Like Europe was populated by people from Anatolia. That's definitely the case. They mixed with some Western hunter-gatherers, but it was mostly Anatolians coming in with agriculture. But the Caucasus, actually, they adopted agriculture. They themselves were hunter-gatherers, and they didn't necessarily intake a ton of Levantine or Anatolian or other DNA from other cultures. So yeah, those 25, totally wrong. Total guesswork, not true. It should go back to being 50 down here. The other 50% of Yamnaya ancestry was Eastern hunter-gatherers,
corresponding with the Proto-Finno-Ugric peoples, ancestral to modern Finns and Hungarians.
And this is the second major blunder. In fact, I would consider it more major of a blunder than with the Caucasians. It's true that Eastern hunter-gatherers are 50% of Proto-Indo-European ancestry. It is not, however, true that the Eastern hunter-gatherers were the quintessential Proto-Finno-Ugric or Proto-Uralic people. And I had to dig pretty deep into this and look into all kinds of different models to explain who the Eastern hunter-gatherers, as we call them archaeologically, are. Because we have a genetic story for who Eastern hunter-gatherers are, and we have an archaeological story for who they are. The archaeological story is all of these culture names you're seeing here, like Pitcomb, Kama, Kelteminar. These are cultures that are Eastern hunter-gatherer, and ancestrally they are themselves, as Eastern hunter-gatherers, basically a mix of Western hunter-gatherer, so that's like European, Paleo-European hunter-gatherer, and North Eurasian hunter-gatherers. Now, I took the liberty of expanding this in my map. Up here in North Asia and North Eurasia, we have three big groups that I've decided to point out. There's this Paleo-Siberian. There's a whole story about what they do over here, influencing and becoming part of the Americas at an early stage. But over here, they contributed to this Paleo-Permian Eastern hunter-gatherers gene pool, as well as they were related to this, I'm calling them Paleo-Iranian, so like the Aral Sea region, Kelteminar, Western Siberian hunter-gatherers. Sometimes that's just another term for this whole thing here. Really, these are related. Again, that about half ancestral North Eurasian and half Western hunter-gatherer. And they are the ones who are contributing to the Yamnayan or Proto-Indo-European horizon. And the earlier you go into that horizon, the larger the percentage of Eastern hunter-gatherer those people are. It starts around the Ural Mountain and about the Volga River up here. And they started to migrate down the rivers. And when they did that, they met the Caucasian Neolithic farmers and herders. So farming doesn't always have to mean you're doing agriculture. A lot of them over here were actually just doing shepherdry and cattle. So they're doing animal husbandry, and they were able to move a lot quicker, but they would still follow and partially farm in these valleys moving up here. These Permian hunter-gatherers, and they became the quintessential Proto-Indo-Europeans. So that's really the story. Starts up here, migrates down to here. So where the Uralic peoples come into this story is the Uralic peoples, that's Hungarians and Finns and Estonians, and also are Permians. They're called Permians. It's really just a category of many different groups like the Mari and others who lived in this region. So the reason I call this Paleo-Permian is because Paleo I would use for hunter-gatherer groups. The Uralic people coming in here, nonetheless, mixed heavily with Eastern hunter-gatherers. So even today, if you look at Estonian populations, for instance, Estonia has some of the highest percentage of Eastern hunter-gatherer ancestry in the world. And so the Estonians are still holding on to a little bit of lineage of the Paleo-Permian ancestry, while still themselves being a Finnic, Finno-Ugric, Uralic people with a Uralic language. Because again, the story of migrations is always the story of layers of ancestry, admixture. It's not replacement. In almost any case, there is not replacement happening. There's some sort of exchange going on. It's true that the Uralic people have some of the highest remaining, surviving Eastern hunter-gatherer ancestry, but that's because their core linguistic and ethnic ancestry comes from the far east, way over in the valley over here. There was a much later migration that they made all the way across Siberia and then into the west. Another interesting thing that a lot of people don't know, there's a really obscure isolated language in the Hindu-Kush region, even to this day, the Burushaski, and they have all kinds of interesting connections to some places and a lot of interesting differences from everyone around them. So they are speaking a language and have an ancestry that is pre-Indo-European. So they resemble people who lived in this region before the Indo-Iranians came in. And they also have a hunter-gatherer ancestry, ancestral North Asian. In fact, they have one of the highest, if not the highest percentage or ancestry of ancestral North Asian. They have a little bit of Iranian Neolithic ancestry as well, when the Oxus civilization kind of got into the area and contributed to some of their ancestry. But nonetheless, they retained a core of ancestral North Asian. They would have been, and I think are, a remnant of these Paleo-Iranians who lived in this whole region and were hunter-gatherers before agriculture came up from the south and before the later Indo-Aryans took over in the region. There's kind of a ghost population. The only remnants we can see are either within surviving lineages with heavier ancestries from other places like Estonians, or with heavily isolated remote mountain highland groups like the Burushaski. So it makes sense why I was a little confused and I couldn't quite find a way to synthesize the linguistic fields with the paleogenetics and the archaeology here. I was trying to force something. It's fine to put that on the paper and test it. And when I tested it, when I put this on the paper and I tested it, I found out, hold on, there's way too much Eastern Eurasian ancestry in the Uralic peoples. And their linguistic core and some of the religious features. There's a lot of things that are more Eastern Eurasian. Also, I got some good comments, critical feedback on my video about this particular issue. And I totally agree with the criticism of me lumping those things together. These are not the same things. Maybe just in your mind think Paleo-Uralians, and that doesn't mean that they're the same people exactly as the Uralic peoples. The main competing hypothesis is the Anatolian hypothesis, put forward by Colin Renfrew in 1987, who argued that Proto-Indo-European may have been spread by Anatolian Neolithic farmers into Europe, Eurasia, Iran, and India during the agricultural revolution in 7000 BC onward. The most archaic Indo-European language family was Anatolic, that of Hittite, Luwian, and Pellaean. Hittite was first attested around 1800 BC in a cuneiform tablet at Hattusa, Anatolia, after the Hittites had conquered it from the Hattian civilization. Anatolic, indeed, including Hittite, it is the oldest remnant of Indo-European. It's the one that seems to have split off the earliest. In fact, it's thought to have split off most certainly before even the Yamnaya existed. Colin Renfrew suggests that since they were the oldest, their homeland may not have been far away in western Anatolia or even eastern Anatolia. This Anatolian hypothesis has been generally dismissed by most linguists, since the Kurgan hypothesis can be corroborated by genetic and archaeological evidence pointing to the dispersal of significant steppe ancestry into Europe, Anatolia, Iran, and India around 3000 BC, aligning more with the probable age of the Proto-Indo-European mother tongue. The migrations of the Anatolian Neolithic farmers were much farther back, and I concur with most linguists, especially since the Hittites seem quite alien to the Hattians. So there were some comments that didn't quite seem to understand what my video was, and honestly, I think if I had a few more hypotheses than just mainly two, it would have been more clear. The video was called Alternative Hypotheses or Alternative Origins of the Indo-Europeans, right? And that is not the best wording ever because it implies that I'm arguing for the alternative, and the only one I provided was the Anatolian one. But I firmly am on the side of the Khvalynsk hypothesis. I hope that's clear. I hope that this shows how clear that is. That being said, there were a lot of comments that were very critical, I would say even excessively critical, of Renfrew's hypothesis. Renfrew isn't like a pseudoscientist. He's not a crackpot. It's not like he's making stuff up. He was an actual academic in the field, investigating a highly complex issue before and during active construction and reconstruction of the Proto-Indo-European and what this homeland might have been, or if there even was a homeland for it, right? So his general hypothesis is actually quite elegant. Like, it was a model that tried to explain how did all these places here in Europe and here in India come to speak the same language. And if you look at it from that general perspective, he looked back at the Neolithic expansion. And when you look at the Neolithic expansion, you see that there is endemic and technological migration of people from the Levant and Anatolia, and then from Mesopotamia and the Caucasus region, out into the steppe, into Iran, into India, and then this way into Europe. That happened. There were people, especially in Europe. Anatolia was a hotspot for that, and the Neolithic revolutions sent people there, right? So he was trying to look at archaeological reality, which is true that, hey, there's a bunch of people that spread into this area. These people hypothetically would have spoken a related language. And there might be remnants of that language here with us today. And he ventured to hypothesize that what if the Indo-European languages, what if the proto-language was older than the steppe hypothesis? What if someone in the Caucasus region, what if these Caucasian Neolithic farmers actually spoke a Proto-Indo-European language, and they spread it from the Caucasus into the steppe, and then that spread elsewhere, right? And that maybe they directly migrated into here, forming the Anatolic languages. And he also thought that maybe that the Anatolic and the Anatolians were the same people, but we would venture to guess that maybe they spread the language into Europe during the Neolithic, in this much older period. So like from 10,000 BC all the way up through 5,000 and so on, kind of like 5,000 years older than the current accepted hypothesis. It's still an elegant model. It just turns out to be probably wrong, right? Now, why is that wrong? How do we disprove that it was Neolithic? Well, we have to find any populations that don't speak an Indo-European language in the Caucasus or in Anatolia or in Europe. And what we find out is when we look at these places, we find a lot of non-Indo-European languages. I mean, there's fewer in Europe and Anatolia, but they do exist, right? The Hurrian, Urartian languages, they are non-Indo-European. The Kartvelian, the Pontic and Caspian, all these branches of Caucasic languages. The Hattic language was not Indo-European. Then we have Etruscan, Tyrrhenian, Basque. When we then cross-reference the genetic archaeological data of these regions, when we look at those exact places that still are holding on to languages that are pre-Indo-European or non-Indo-European, we find a large percentage of Anatolian Neolithic farmer, right? So we find people that are registered to here. And we know archaeologically that this period, between 10,000 and 5,000 BC, is when those people populated Europe, right? And we also look at all these Caucasian groups that don't speak Indo-European languages, and they are still living kind of where they lived that whole time. So yeah, That is why it's disproven. It's not just a stupid, dumb idea. It is true that there were people who spread language during the Neolithic. The Caucasian farmers, they spread a language that branched off and became all these different isolated languages today. And the same thing is true for a lot of these isolated groups in the Mediterranean. These are now considered isolated Paleo-European languages, but they're undeniably archaeologically based on an Anatolian Neolithic population, and therefore probably a mother tongue that they all descended from Anatolian. Same thing goes over here with the Zagrosians. We have it's not like a completely advanced theory, but it's gaining strength of the relationship between Dravidian and Susian Elamite languages. And when you look at the genetic data, you see that these people, the bulk and core of their ancestry is Iranian Neolithic farmer. So in all of these patterns, including Afro-Asiatic and the Tufians, we're seeing a pattern that the Neolithic farmers spread the language in a lot of these cases. And even the Indo-European languages spread a kind of Neolithic. They were highly adept at mobile, nomadic horse and cattle culture, right? And that is a kind of Neolithic. It's a kind of agricultural revolution. It's part of my general model, I think, that almost all major language families that have spread and dominated older hunter-gatherer language families or remnants are Neolithic or agricultural. And the Hattians, of all peoples, were most likely the direct descendants of the indigenous Neolithic Anatolian Tash-Tepler culture in southern Anatolia and upper Mesopotamia. This is the culture associated with Göbekli Tepe. This is a very small difference, I think, between my new map and my old map. Right here, I give Taurians as the name for the Anatolian Neolithic farmers tied to the Tash-Tepler and Göbekli Tepe kind of civilizational horizon. And Taurians is still a great word for the kind of indigenous Anatolian farmers. But I have them ranging up into Hurrian territories and also Pontic, Hattian territories. And current ancestral models show that Hattians, both linguistically and genetically, were descended more from Caucasian hunter-gatherers and Neolithic farmers than from Anatolian hunter-gatherers and Neolithic farmers. So there was a general split in Anatolia between the South Taurus Mountains kind of and Western, which this was like Anatolian Taurian, and then this up here, this Hattian branch, was closely linked, interestingly, to the Pontic languages. Again, the Pontic languages, like Circassian and Abkhazian, are actually closest related to the Caucasian herders that entered the Yamnaya and such horizon. And so it's kind of a funny story when you look at it that way, with the Hattians coming here during the Neolithic, and then near the Bronze Age having the Anatolians come down here with maybe some of their cousins among them in a way. Nonetheless, conflating the Hattians with the Taurians is not possible. We can't exactly reconstruct what the Anatolian religion was by only using the Hattians, even though they are the most well-survived, I guess, remnant in this region of what would pre-Indo-European religion be like.
But how did the Yamnaya and their Indo-European successors come to assimilate and dominate the demographically dominant farmers south of the steppe horizon? From about 3450 to 3000 BCE, populations and settlements in Europe experienced a sharp decline, referred to as the Neolithic Decline. Its most probable causes include climate change, overfarming, plague, invasion, or a combination of these. Yersinia pestis, The same pneumonic bacterium responsible for the Justinian plague and the Black Plague was found in remains across Europe between 3000 and 2900 BC, sometimes even within mass burials. The Burned House Horizon also was a region encompassing the Khvalynsk culture, Danube River, and Yamnaya steppe, where entire settlements were regularly burned from 6500 to 2000 BC. The Khvalynsk culture's settlements were densely packed, some with populations estimated between 10 and 20,000, comparable to Sumerian cities at the time. Domesticated animals also lived within these cities, further suggesting that regular plagues might have occurred. Regularly burning down the entire settlement might have been the most reliable way to cleanse them of bacteria. But, of course, these densely packed cities provided the perfect petri dishes for said bacteria to evolve, becoming more and more deadly, until by 3000 BC, a super deadly strain may have wreaked havoc on the entire continent. Since the Yamnaya were also part of the Burned House Horizon, yet were in the periphery of the densely packed cities in Moldavia, they may have developed something of an immunity. Thus, when more densely populated settlements across Europe were being decimated by plague, the Yamnaya would have had a great opportunity to flood into the vacuum left behind. Some of the first Indo-European people recorded in Europe and Anatolia were the Mycenaeans and Hittites around 2000 BCE, notoriously warlike peoples who seem to have mostly occupied the upper and warrior classes of each society.
Yeah, the Hittites, or the Anatolian peoples, and the Greeks did not come into Europe at the same exact time. The Anatolians were definitely before, because the Balkan peoples, the Balkan Yamnayan peoples, were still infiltrating into the Danube Basin. Between 3000 and 2000 BC is when we start seeing the Hellenic language and culture kind of crystallizing out of the indigenous Pelasgians mixing with incoming warrior class and other of this Balkan types. One place where I think the warrior culture between the Hittites and the Mycenaeans specifically is quite interesting is both began using chariots in warfare around the same time, like 1600 BC. And this is what the Hittites are using to conquer the Hattians. And it eventually is part of what the Mycenaeans used to unify Greece during, the Agamemnon type cycle.
Further genetic evidence shows that steppe ancestry in Europe and Anatolia was mostly brought by Y haplogroups, men, whereas a significant portion of Neolithic Anatolian ancestry has been retained by women. This further supports the possibility of a violent invasion of Yamnaya warrior men. There is a well-documented Indo-European tradition, for instance, where all but the firstborn sons of a tribe would be ritually banished into the wilderness in order to harden themselves. These feral youths were called wolves, and although they were intended to return to the village when they had proven themselves, they would often form war bands with each other and found their own tribes by cattle raiding, abducting women, and perhaps conquering foreign settlements. Some of the greatest evidence for violence in the Indo-European migrations can be found in Poland and Germany, where there are various mass graves with signs of trauma. These correspond with the corded ware culture's replacement of the globular amphora culture, funnel beaker cultures in northern Europe. This violent wave evolved directly into the battle axe culture, which may have further evolved into the Germanic cultures. Consider the eerily similar clash of the warlike Aesir gods and the agrarian Vanir gods in Norse myth.
Let's look into that. I highlighted the corded ware in this one. And so in a lot of that video, I didn't go into the results very much. But I'm going to expand on it a little bit more. Because I dropped the corded ware a little bit, I'd like to go into them and a little bit of the difference between them and the Yamnian group. So I generally, and many scholars generally, split the Indo-Europeans into two branches. There's multiple dimensions of the split that correlate, and that's why the split is so useful. So I call them Yamnian and Varian, and the difference is really early and late in a sense, the first and the second. The first wave, the Yamnian wave, corresponds a lot of times with the haplogroup R1b in males, also with centum Indo-European languages, so they have the word, the archaic form of or kentum, and the bulk of their ancestry still has a lot of this original 50-50 split of Caucasian and Eastern hunter-gatherer, right? So that's the first kind of wave. The second wave here is R1A coded in males and Satum languages. So these are like a later innovation that happened somewhere around this horizon, where the hard kentum centum softened into a Satum. And then they also have a sizable proportion influx of early European farmer ancestry, so Anatolian Neolithic derived ancestry. And that's kind of fun and interesting because I didn't go into this distinction in my video, but it would have helped me understand why it was that we have to treat the Caucasian and the Anatolian Neolithics and ancestries different, because there's a reason that this northern branch took early European ancestry and actually brought it over towards Indo-Iranian. There are Indo-Iranian descended peoples who have early European farmer, Anatolian Neolithic farmer ancestry in very minor amounts, far more minor than the other two percentages, but nonetheless. So that means that this first branch came over here into the forest steppe. So this is like where the forests of the north were running into the steppe, and met all of these eastern hunter-gatherer peoples. And along the periphery of that, going toward the west, they encountered these funnel beaker and globular amphora, like my video was showing globular amphora right there. These are Danubian descended early European farmer groups, and they were farming up in the Baltic. They were farming in Poland. They were farming in Scandinavia and Denmark in the southern parts before these corded ware variants came in. And when they came in, they took wives, as they do. They not only spread further west, but they also went east and became Indo-Iranian. So this is the same kind of period, 2900 2000, 2900 14, 2900 to 28. So these early pushes very drastically, very quickly started to influence Northern Europe. And that's a separate secondary wave from the first pulse. So the first wave of the Yamnaya, just to break down the waves in general for you. First, of course, we've been over a million times, Anatolic. Earliest wave was over here into the Balkans, and that's probably correlated with this wave to some degree. There was like a few that kept going and a few that kind of stayed in the Balkan region. A Balkan branch, of course, became Thraco-Dacian and Illyrian and the Dardanian or Phrygian, Mysian, and Hellenic languages. A lot of these are kind of dead languages. They don't exist anymore, and we can't even study them very well. The third branch of the first wave went all the way across the Central Asian steppe and became Tocharians. Their first name archaeologically is the Afanasyavo, and they actually were kind of up here hanging out with the Paleo-Siberians at the time. And they eventually migrated and found themselves in the Tarim Basin over here for a very long time. They have a centum language, and they carry the R1b. And this is how we're able to kind of track this. We can track that that's first wave. And it's interesting because we can see with the Indo-Iranians that there are R1a and Satem. So how do you get these two different branches in this area? People assume that Tocharian might have been related to Indo-Iranian, but actually it came earlier, and it came through those wagons, right? So early, slow kind of migration, the same kind of migration that probably the Anatolic and Balkan people first did around the same time. And then the final branch of the first wave would be Armenian, and Armenian is a Satem language, not necessarily because it is derived from a Satem language, but because it was so heavily influenced by Median Persian, Iranian religion and culture and language over time that it switched and got its language kind of twisted a bit. When we look at the Armenians, we see that it actually is closely linked its language to Hellenic, oddly enough, on the other side of Anatolia. And I'm not even entirely sure about what's going on here. I have a hypothesis having to do with their relationship to the Hurrians and the Indo-Aryan upper class of the Hurrians that people spoke about. But the current hypothesis is that they kind of came in here, possibly from this direction, around the same time or in some sort of related fashion to the Hellenic or Balkan wave. Again, I'm not entirely sure what the mainstream rationale is. It seems to be all over the place. So Armenian, a big mystery. Then, like I covered with the Varian corded Ware, there are really two branches that we can treat as existing today. There's Balto-Slavic, which is relatively right where its homeland has always been, and then over, of course, with Indo-Iranian. The other interesting branch, also having to do with chariots, is, I said, Santashta and Dronovo culture invaded chariots, and they quickly put them to use, and the technology spread in the Hurrians started picking it up. The Hittites soon picked it up, like I said, but they themselves used it for travel and warfare in Iran and in India. And it was about 15,000 or 1500 BC and 1600 BC that the Iranian and Indian kind of languages or language families began to branch out. And in India, that would be coming in and having an upper class of Brahmins, warriors, and such over the indigenous Indus Valley civilization and the remnants of it, which would have been probably most likely related to Dravidians that still live in southern India today. In Iran, there are a few little branches. The median branch is kind of this Western Iranian branch, and the Persian is kind of the main central Iranian branch. Then the other two are Scythians, which start up here, and then they actually moved all the way into the steppe, reoccupying the homeland of their ancestors in the Yamnaya, and even influencing and bridging up against the Balkans and such, and the Caucasus as well. While the Turanians, on the other hand, retained and remained in this Central Asian kind of corridor, doing their thing for a very long time. So, and then there are a bunch of ghost populations. And this is where my statement that Germanic might have descended from the battle axe culture, the battle axe culture being directly derived from the corded Ware, gets a little complicated. So the Germanic language is pretty complex, and its relationship to other Indo-European languages is quite confusing. It all starts from this confusing part right here, Pannonian. I named it as a kind of cultural horizon or branch of Indo-European that includes Italic and Venetic, and those two are closely related. Celtic, which is related. Italo-Celtic is a accepted branch of Indo-European. Belgic, which is often considered a Celtic or Gaulish language, but it actually has features like Venetic that have almost Germanic features to them as well as Celtic and Italic and Celto-Italic. So there's definitely something going on with those two kind of vestigial pieces. And then Germanic often is considered part of the Italo-Celto-Germanic branch, but it's not always accepted because there are so many features in Germanic that are related to or similar to Balto-Slavic. And it's thought that either they get those just from proximity or from some deep ancestral mixture or relationship. The Celtic has a few little sub-migrations. There's the Q Celtic languages and then the P Celtic languages. And these appear to be, the Q Celtic has a qua sound that's still there, and the P Celtic replaces the qua with the p sound. And this seems to be a Eastern innovation in language of some kind that spread into Celtic regions in Western Europe alongside some of the elite warrior class charioteers, that late stage Celtic. The earliest Celtic wave or migration is one branch went down around 2500 to 2000 BC became Celtiberian. The other branch went up into Britain and became Gaelic or Goidelic languages. The secondary wave of the P Celtic actually came in around 1200, 900. So this is, again, that kind of chariot culture is spreading from down here. It's impacting, the Hittites are using it, and the Mycenaeans are using it, and then it's kind of traveling technologically up here into Italy and Celtic region, and they adopt it, and by 1200 they're heading up into Britain, and they spread the Brythonic languages, like Welsh, Cornish, and such, into Britain, pushing the Gaelic northward and towards Ireland, and then the other one going down into Gaul and pushing into Celtiberian a little bit. And so those little fringe edges of the Celtic world retained kind of older features. Features that, by the way, resembled a lot of Pannonian, like really old features. But of course, that's mostly like an upper class variant. And so the distinction between these two is not super huge. So Germanic is also a centum language, and that would make it not seem to be a satum derived language. Although the whole idea of centum and satum these days is kind of thrown out, even though I still find it useful, because it's assumed to be an innovation that maybe the Scythians had that interacted with Balto-Slavic and Indo-Iranian and also potentially Armenian to get them to adopt that innovation, that fad in their kind of accent, so to speak. Whereas obviously Germanic and all these other languages are so far away from the Scythian influence that they didn't adopt this fad. So that's probably true for that, but nonetheless we're seeing a pattern here. If the battle axe culture is directly derived from the cordware, and the cordware ancestrally are very heavily R1A, then why is Germanic largely an R1B, which is 40% and 25% R1A? So the other percents are largely, Anatolian Neolithic farmer as usual, and hunter-gatherers of various kinds around here, Western, Eastern. The percentages here really are implying that the Germanic language proper, the core language, probably descended from the R1B group, from Pannonian, and that maybe through proximity or from the mixing between the incoming Germanic peoples and the hoarded ware battle axe culture here created a very unique mix. I looked into the archaeology of this because I always try to understand a story of like where these people came from, how they adapt. And it's referring to the Belgic people, the Northwest Bloc hypothesis. And that hypothesis states that there was a group of Proto-Italo-Celtic people during the early Indo-European wave into Neolithic Europe, where the incoming Belbeaker kind of Italo-Celtic people mixed with some, as you can see this line here, corded Ware culture's influence was over here in the Rhine River Valley and the Netherlands to become an interesting, unique mix of R1A and R1B on the edge here. And then they, taking from the innovations of a lot of other Proto-Celtic peoples, were seafarers, and they took to settling on northern Germany and Denmark and Scandinavia. And through seafaring, they kind of mixed and dominated the local battle axe culture. It comes from a bit of both worlds. So yes, I mean, those are all the major branches of Indo-European, and hopefully some people could read this and some things could start to make sense. Yeah, that's kind of the big picture there of the branches. I hope that's a little helpful. If you have any questions, criticisms, feel free to comment.